Yeah, I'm going to be talking about a little bit about AI consciousness, the recent debate, and trying to trace back a little bit of what Dave has been saying about this. And I was a little bit shocked that Martina talked so much about Joe and all the kind of replacement. So I cut that a little bit, but I still want to talk about Joe, because that could be an alternative title. What is it like to be Joe? It's a character in Dave's book that didn't become so famous as like the zombies, but he's still there. It's like up there with Mary and all the others, you know. So it's an interesting person, as you will see. So if you look at this development of the AI consciousness debate, it's striking that, you know, in this very nice book by Stuart Russell, he writes in 2019, in the area of consciousness, we really do know nothing, so I'm going to say nothing. No one in AI is working on making machines conscious, nor would anyone know where to start, and no behavior has consciousness as a prerequisite. 3 years later, Ilya Sutskever tweeted, it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. Okay, so what happened? You know, you might wonder. Well, Dave gave an answer in a recent interview from this month with Daniel Brucker, raise your hand, in the German magazine Philosophie. And of course, ChatGPT was released in 2022, and people are impressed by it. And I just want to, they go through like Dave's credences, like when you gave the Europe's talk in 2022, one day before ChatGPT was released, you had a 10%, you gave a 10% chance that anything like AI would be conscious. Later on, maybe in 10 years, you estimated, when Albert is retiring in 2032, you estimated that it will be 25%, but most recently, you know, maybe it already has reached 50%. So you're almost 50%. Can I claim that? I think that's what stands there. I don't know. So, you know, anyone? You know, is anyone interested in AI consciousness? Do they have it? I think that people want to know, you know. People want to find out. Very exciting. And last fall, there has been a wave of papers on this. Many people put out papers, like, you know, on arXiv and everywhere else in this debate. And it's interesting to see just what they have in mind. What is the target? What do they talk about when they want to assess AI consciousness or consciousness in AI? So the debate so far, I think, has several positions. It's dominated by a clash of, or an opposition between computational functionalism that I don't have to introduce. So the right kind of program is sufficient for consciousness. And the opposing view, biological naturalism, it comes in various flavors, which holds that basically, or makes an argument that, you know, the biological or biochemical machinery of the brain is very important for consciousness, so it's unlikely that you can rebuild that in a different system made of silicon. There is a recent book by Blaise Aguirre-Iacas from Google, whose underlying claim is really like life is a computation. So that if that was true, then I think that opposition would be overthrown, because then there's computation all the way down in biology, and then you may be, there's no argument there again. There's some agnosticism. I don't know who else, apart from Tom McClelland, says that we won't know. You know, there's no evidence forthcoming, at least empirical evidence, to decide which of these positions is right. There's no positive evidence for computational functionalism. There's also no positive evidence for biological naturalism. It's not clear whether this is the state or whether we can say more towards one of these sides. But Dave has, of course, all anticipated this when he talked about the principle of organizational invariance in one of his early articles that have been featured here at the meeting, because the principle states that any two systems with the same fine-grained functional organization will have qualitatively identical experiences. And the opposition, at the time it was famously Searle, they would have said that consciousness is tied to a specific biology, so you have these two opposing views there already. What I want to do in this talk is start with talking a little bit about phenomenal consciousness and its career ever since Dave's book, and also like the accompanying article by Ned Block in 1995 about phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, and what people have made about this, and whether it will be fit to be a candidate to be assessed in AI. And therefore we have to look at the odds for computational functionalism, because computational functionalism is typically assumed by people who claim that AI consciousness is possible. And then when I'm done there dismissing that, I'm going to see what we can expect to find, if I get there, but I hope. So just to show you that people are really interested in phenomenal consciousness in AI, here are some highlights from these papers. So this is the MEAT paper by Ned Block. Of course, it's about phenomenal consciousness. There's something it's like. Also, Jonathan Birch in his manifesto makes clear that he's talking about what it's like in Thomas Nagel's sense, and Susan Schneider and co-authors, Eric Schwitzgebel and others. It's about phenomenal consciousness, the inner experience as first-person experience, and so on. So that's really the target. It's not that they want to claim we want to look for access consciousness or cognitive access or something like that. So it's really about that. But as you will see, phenomenal consciousness can be very confusing. And just to start off with familiar territory, of course, one way of outlining or isolating it is the way that Dave has decided to do with the heart problem. So it's a problem, the phenomenal consciousness poses a problem that is different from the so-called easy problem. So you can explain all kinds of objective, cognitive, and behavioral functions and so on. And always phenomenal consciousness or subjective experience will be left out. There's always a further question, and that has been, of course, talked about a lot yesterday. So there's these two concepts of mind, a phenomenal concept of mind and a psychological concept of mind. And, everything that can be said about causal roles and functions and so on is missing the point when it comes to phenomenology. So cognitive science seems to be on a track then, towards investigating behavior, structure and function, or computations. Pick your favorite, but this is like the stuff that can be investigated with the methods of cognitive science and reductively explained, but phenomenal consciousness is sort of isolated there. It's not clear where to start, what to do. And to move on, Ned Block's career is interesting because he has, I think, changed his mind about this, and not many people look at it this way. But I think that's at least fruitful way to look at it this way if you look at what he's writing. So he started off with his early paper on a confusion about a function of consciousness, and he introduced phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness as two different kinds of consciousness. That was his initial idea. So there's two kinds of consciousness, and access consciousness is not only cognition, but he introduced it as a distinct type of consciousness. And then, of course, people like Stanislas Dehaene, they claimed that, investigating consciousness requires attention and report to prepare consciousness for the laboratory rigorously. We have to rely on reports by people, either by button press or they say something, I see red or I see the cross or something like that. And of course, the attention is necessary, and it sort of is responsible for the restricted access. But Block wasn't satisfied. No, we don't need report and we don't need attention. We are conscious of much more than the bottleneck of attention allows. But in his next BBS paper in 2007, he dropped the claim that it is a distinct kind of consciousness. So he introduced the terminology of phenomenology or phenomenality on the one hand, and cognitive access on the other, or accessibility, and claimed that, and the claims were only about the overflow of the content of what we are aware or what we can report and what we cannot report. So there's a claim in the paper that, certain patients show us that there can be phenomenally conscious contents that we cannot access, and that we don't even know about. There's not only the unconscious, but there's also a part of the consciously experienced content that we cannot report because it overflows access. And then cognitive access is, of course, then in Block's view, limited by the bottleneck of attention. He appealed to the famous Sperling data, and Victor Lame had run a series of experiments showing that with change blindness and so on. So, okay, so it's no longer different concepts of consciousness, it seems, because he dropped the consciousness in the access notion. And then, of course, people were ingenious. Scientists came up with no-report paradigms, and they wanted to bypass reports to find out whether Block is right, whether there is really a different neural signature as Ned Block has claimed. So he said there might be two different neural correlates, one in the back of the head, one in the front of the head, basically. And he said that, activation in the back of the head, in the visual cortex, for example, would be sufficient for phenomenal consciousness, even though we cannot report it. So Stefan Freisler, I think, and now Chia and others have used other measures like this kind of nystagmus, the involuntary eye movements that we perform when we see things, and wanted to make sure that we have binocular rivalry and experience it. And then a very different pattern emerged. On the left, you can see the kind of attention, global workspace type of activation that Stanislas Dehaene favors for conscious report. And they got a very different activation for in case B, when there's no report being asked. Okay, that's fine, that's exciting, should be good for Block and bad for Dehaene, but Block didn't like that. So the last bit I heard is that, Ned wants to have not no report paradigms, but no cognition paradigms. So we need to, in order to get at phenomenal consciousness, we require no cognition paradigms, and it's not clear whether that can be handled methodologically. How do you ensure that cognition or metacognitive processes are shut down, shut out? So that is going to be methodologically very difficult, and I'm not sure what's next. So, but it seems that Ned has been shifting the goalpost, so he's never satisfied with getting at phenomenal consciousness. It's very shielded away in some kind of treasure bank in Fort Knox. It's difficult to get there. That's just one story. And the next story would be to look at how scientists have dealt with phenomenal consciousness. So, of course, Stanislas Dehaene has written this impressive book 12 years ago, where he says we should focus on conscious access. This is a well-defined phenomenon because we can make reports and can demonstrate when people have access to information they were exposed to. And so he writes there in the beginning of the book, some philosophers, maybe some in the room, still think that none of the above ideas will suffice to solve the problem. The heart of the problem, they believe, lies in another sense of consciousness, which they call phenomenal awareness. The intuitive feeling present in all of us that our internal experiences possess exclusive qualities, unique qualia, and so on. And these inner qualities, they argue, can never be reduced to a scientific neural description. By nature, they are personal and subjective, and thus they defy any exhaustive verbal communication to others. But I disagree, and I will argue that the notion of a phenomenal consciousness that is distinct from conscious access is highly misleading and leads down a slippery slope to dualism, right? That has been proven in 1996, right? So we should start simple and first study conscious access and then see how far we get. So that's good. There's another recent paper in the wonderful collection that Lucia and Umberto Alchese are editing by Lionel Lacache, another proponent of the global workspace theory, and he has a similar formulation, but he doesn't think it leads you down the path to dualism, but to panpsychism. So he's afraid of panpsychism. So, but he changed his mind. So when the adversarial collaboration to find the neural correlates of consciousness and test theories against each other, IIT against global workspace theory, when this was pitched, there's a very, very wonderful summarizing article by Liad and all people involved, as you can see. And the authors, they are responsible for their section. So it says, like, you know, Stanislas Dehaene wrote that. And he writes, what is the scope of global workspace theory? The theory aims to account for two different things. One is conscious processing, and the other is conscious phenomenology. Ooh, I think the theory hasn't changed much, but suddenly, out of magic, it explains more than it was intended to explain. So it can be confusing, I think. And I don't know, this is a bit of a, you know, bad move, you know. So it's cheating, isn't it? Stick to your initial thought. Another example, of course, in a very seminal article Dave wrote with Andy Clark on the extended mind, they make a very interesting and very compelling argument that cognitive processes can extend into the body, into the environment, into our smartphones, which made Ned Block claim that this claim was false before smartphones, but when the iPhone was released, it was a true claim, so it became true later, something like that. So of course, and it's impressive and it's very plausible, but they claimed that, and they claimed that jointly, that while cognitive processes can extend into the body and physical social environment, consciousness is probably brain-bound. There's a conscious core that doesn't extend. And they had various thoughts about why that would be so, and they dismissed them later, but, you know, just to give you an idea, that's a joint claim. So in the preface to Andy's book, in Supersizing the Mind, Dave wrote that, you know, maybe our low bandwidth conscious connection to the environment seems to have the wrong form as it stands. Maybe only the brain can do the job of, you know, driving consciousness. He tentatively concludes that the extension of the mind is compatible with retaining an internal conscious core. And this was echoed in an article by Andy Clark a year later. The bandwidth argument seems to be, at the time, a good argument to show that consciousness is brain-bound. Carina Wold, to mention it, wrote later, put forward a nice argument debunking this kind of claim, and they said we can run the same argument for phenomenal consciousness, that it must be extended. My point is that Andy and Dave have very different views on what they mean by consciousness. So Dave, of course, in an email I didn't dig out, but, you know, I have it still. I asked you once when I was writing a paper that hasn't been published, and you answered, of course I mean phenomenal consciousness, right? That's the interesting notion, that's what you answered. But that's not what Andy can mean by consciousness. So here's Andy, a little visitor.
I suppose that what I think, and what I think a number of people here, Dan Dennett too, think, is that there's an important sense in which it's all access consciousness. So, in a way, that's perhaps the only sense in which we might want to say it's an illusion. The illusion is that there is something other than access consciousness going on. If by access consciousness you mean what I do, which is something like the computation of contents. So, I think the thought, for me at least, is that the computation of content replaces the notion of the computation of something mysterious like qualitative features. So that in that sense you could say it's not really an illusion, but we could fool ourselves into thinking that there's more to explain than actually there is. Something like that.
Andy was supposed to be here, but he's on holiday in Mallorca, so we should grant him that. But it's a good, so 2 points. Of course, it's only computation of content, so on the one hand, it doesn't seem very plausible to me that then he can single out a certain kind of computation of content that cannot extend, if everything else is also just computation of content. So why would you have to say that, you know, consciousness is brain-bound if it's only computation of content? But the other sense is like, you know, they're not making the same claim. Phenomenal consciousness can be confusing, that's what I say, as a target. But I want to do some shameless advertising. We had another anniversary conference in Boulder 3 years ago, celebrating the 25 years of the Extended Mind paper, and there will be a collection coming out with new work on that soonish. So yeah, to sum up, phenomenal consciousness, you know, we started out with Nagel, who was very like agnostic, epistemic, Is physicalism false? No, he didn't think so. We don't understand it. But of course, then we have different understandings what phenomenal consciousness could be, a biological property, a robustly functional property, or a non-physical, non-functional, non-psychological property that is even epiphenomenal. And if you ask about AI consciousness, well, on Ned's understanding, it's maybe unlikely because he emphasizes neurobiology. On Dan's conception that maybe is shared with Dehaan, it's likely, with a very different kind of computer than we have today. And on Dave's conception, apparently, it's very likely, 50%. But, what are people looking for when they want to investigate and assess consciousness in AI? What is the indicator that gives you something? Because for phenomenal consciousness, I think the ultimate goalpost would be first-person data, first-person experience. But this is not report. Report is a third-person behavior, right? So let's look at the debate and the odds of computational functionalism, if I have time. Yes, okay. So this came out 2 days ago. So Ryota Kanai, another friend of ours in the community, just published a new paper where he writes that, I don't know what the intrinsic is doing there, but I don't know, there can be a philosophical paper against that. But if we accept intrinsic computational functionalism, which I think is a highly plausible metaphysical position, and so on. So yeah, and other people also are just assuming or taking computational functionalism about consciousness as a very plausible starting point. And this goes back a long way. There could be a lecture on that about where this is coming from. It's a country for old men. So let's look at the recent debate. So apparently there's a decision there, and a lesson from the McCullough and Pitts paper in 1943, that we know intuitively what is relevant for cognition and consciousness in the sense that what neurons are doing in the brain. So there's a decision that you can ignore biochemical details like ion channels and neurotransmitters and focus on what is allegedly functionally relevant, and then you can apply that to the consciousness debate. And what is relevant? Well, spike trains and spike rates, spike timing, and that can all be specified in abstraction from any physical medium, like Piccinini writes. And if you buy that, then you can, of course, focus on computational correlates of consciousness. And this is what recent neuroscience has been obsessed with, moving from neural correlates of consciousness in the 90s. Dave had this nice overview of the decades. Maybe computational correlates is now like a new identifying goal for this decade. And recently, Dave gave a talk in Bamberg in one of the wonderful meetings that Johannes is organizing. And, or was it? Yeah, it was. And so, applying computational theories of consciousness to AI, he claims, requires universal computational correlates, not only human computational correlates. And what is a computational correlate? Well, here's a nice paper from one of our other friends here in the room in 2005. It would be principles of information processing with which to characterize the differences between conscious and unconscious processing. There are various candidates. A global workspace is one intuitive candidate, and we can have a look at a research program outlined by Patrick Butlin, and Dave was also a co-author on that paper. So they proposed to look at neuroscience, because neuroscientific theories provide us with well-supported neural indicators of consciousness. Stanislas Dehaan has like 4 signatures of consciousness. Then you would just assume computational functionalism because that allows for AI consciousness in principle, and you extract from the theories so-called computational indicators, and then if they accumulate in a system, then it's more likely to be conscious. And you can apply that to an AI system because the computational indicators will be medium independent, that is, they will be independent from any kind of biological realization. And this is the case in the global neural workspace theory, where Stan says that consciousness is a computational property, and in principle, the architecture underlying consciousness could be implemented in machines. So he identifies in his book 4 signatures of consciousness. You could then assume computational functionalism, do some modeling, and then Butlin et al., they propose these 4 computational indicators. I don't want to, it's not important, you don't have to read them. but you get rid of the neural details and then claim that these can be medium independent and can be implemented in any kind of silicon machine, right? But it's like, okay, if you look back at Putnam, Putnam said, computational functionalism was empirically very much more plausible than the mind-brain identity theory. That was 1965. But he didn't say or tell us how we should support that claim. It's very intuitive to say, multiple realizability, we shouldn't be brain chauvinists and so on, so other creatures could have pain, but he didn't say what we should look for. I think he had a coarse-grained, if you say ouch, then you are in pain, something like that, right? So he had no way of telling or showing that this computational functionalism was really superior. And if you move to problems for this, computationalism requires medium independence, as I said. And of course, Hawkland illustrated medium independence with sports, so let's do that. So chess, for example, according to John Hawkland, is a medium independent game because you can even play it in your head. You don't need a board, you can just imagine what the moves are. You just need a lookup table, h5 goes to wherever, and then that's it. And Stefan Zweig's chess novella shows you how this is done. But basketball or football, they are medium dependent. You need a certain size of a playing field, you need a certain ball, and you do certain moves. And OG was, of course, very good in this. So this is medium dependent. You can't do it in any kind of medium. It should be intuitive. So computational functionalism assumes that computation is medium independent, but there are different kinds of computation, and it's not clear what neural computation in the brain is like if we assume that consciousness is a kind of computation. So Corey Maley says the brain uses analog computation, and analog computation is medium dependent. Gualtiero Piccinini claims that it's neither digital nor analog, but it's a computation sui generis, and he defines computation in terms of medium independence. So it's trivial for him that it would be medium independent, but just because he defines it that way, it's stipulation. So it's an open question why neural computation would be sui generis, because maybe it's not medium independent, and then we have a problem. And Dave conceded so much in this talk in Bamberg when he said that the empirical evidence for computational correlates is usually for there being a human CCC, because global workspace theory is supported by evidence from human brains, right? Not a universal CCC that would be true for all systems, for snails and for AI and so on, command data. But I think no. Empirical evidence supports mostly human NCCs, because alleged CCCs have never been confirmed outside biological systems. Who has tested the global workspace theory and shown that an AI without biology is conscious? It's a good guess, so people have various candidates. There are various computational correlates that could be true, and it's difficult to disprove them, but it's not proven that the evidence leans towards their way. They're leaning towards neural realizations of computational correlates, if there are computational correlates. So that would be my disagreement. There's lots of pushback here that emphasizes various ways in which biology could be important. I take that to be familiar from the recent debate. I don't want to dwell on it. And it goes back a little bit to what Ned Block called the harder problem of consciousness. How can we decide whether functionalism or physicalism or biologism is true? And he asks the global workspace people, how do you know that it is broadcasting in the global workspace that makes a representation conscious, as opposed to something about the human biological realization of that broadcasting? I think that's a very reasonable question, because the evidence has been obtained only on human brains, mostly on human brains, and so never outside that. So there's no evidence for a universal CCC. That's just a leap of faith. And I wanted to cut it short, but I still want to talk about Joe. So how much time do I have? It's 30 minutes in, okay. So if the empirical evidence is not very good, Dave says we have to support or complement the empirical arguments for computational functionalism with a priori considerations. So they need help. And here's one, and the fading qualia argument is a response to alleged absent qualia arguments of the sort that Ned introduced with the China nation robot. So it's a reductio argument. You assume that absent qualia are naturally possible. So it's an a priori argument, but it's about natural possibility. It's not about zombie worlds. So then there could be a system which we call robot with the same functional organization as a conscious system but lacking consciousness on that hypothesis. This may be because robot is made of silicon rather than having a brain like Dave. No one has a brain like Dave, right? So we can then gradually replace neurons in Dave's brain by silicon chips, preserving the local functions of each neuron and making sure each resulting system in the sequence is functionally isomorphic to the original Dave. Okay, so that could look like this. That is, ChatGPT helped with that, so that would be the kind of transition where you start with replacing one neuron, and then you go all the way until you turn into a machine. I wouldn't suggest doing it, Dave. you look much better now. So that's, but so he writes that, I think he anticipates all the kinds of objections that have been aired now by Rosa Sao and Masvita Chirimuta and so on, because he says where the state of the neuron is sensitive to electrical inputs and chemical signals, the silicon chip will be sensitive to the same, also to the chemical signals. So we can imagine tiny transducers that take in electrical signals and chemical ions, and it produces the same outputs. So the input-output function of the chip is precisely the same as that of the neuron. And Dave is not very interested in technical feasibility, because that can be overcome, but it's just like he's arguing for a conditional, that's important. So if that were possible, then we should assume that Dave would retain consciousness until he is turned into a robot. Right? And he discusses two possibilities, what could happen on the side of the absent qualia hypothesis. Well, consciousness could gradually fade, or it could be suddenly blink out after you have replaced neuron 47 or something like that. And he calls that the fading qualia and the suddenly disappearing qualia hypothesis. And the possibility of suddenly disappearing qualia is dismissed very quickly because it would be bizarre and arbitrary if replacing any single neuron, like 47 rather than 46, that would make such a big difference in terms of laws and in terms of stability of the system. And then you are left with fading qualia. To get a fix on this scenario, you imagine Joe. That system is halfway through the replacement or something like that. And he asks, what is it like to be Joe? And finally, we have arrived at the title of this talk. So Joe, of course, is functionally isomorphic to me. He says all the same things about his experience as I do about mine. And he says that if qualia were really fading gradually, this would imply that Joe is systematically wrong about all his experiences, and such a strong dissociation between consciousness and cognition is also implausible, just like the other scenarios. And therefore, then he concludes that we should believe in the principle of organizational invariance that is not under that name, but is underlying the assumption in the computational functionalist argument. But I would say, if you look at Joe, on Dave's view, phenomenal consciousness is already causally and explanatorily inert. It is dissociated from any psychological, physical, and functional processes. None of our phenomenal judgments, as we will hear from Francois later, are caused by experience, for example. Why would violating organizational invariance make it any stranger? The argument, as I said, only supports a conditional. If it were possible to replace neurons by chips preserving functional equivalence, Joe should remain conscious. But this remains a theoretical possibility because we don't even know what equivalence requires. What is the level of grain that we have to ensure? Do we have to just say the systems are equivalent when they both say ouch? Or do we have to say, intraneuron equivalence on the level of molecules must be ensured, all the chemical signals and so on must be functionally identified. The assumption is that we can, to make it technically feasible, to identify the function of a single neuron, the functional profile of a single neuron, of each neuron of the brain, and then replace it and the role that it plays in kinds of different contexts. This is very questionable that it is possible, And it seems to be a question begging against biological naturalists, as Tom McLennan argues, because if organizational invariance doesn't hold, then qualia would fade away. And then how would we find out? Right. Just a little joke. Let's finish off with how we can assess consciousness. If you look at Boston Dynamics and you're impressed by what they do with robots, right? You can ask your engineer, did you manage to write the algorithm that the robot can do a backflip, right? And fair enough, you can just observe it. Well, good work, go home, right? You have done it, you have made a good job. We can test whether we succeeded in creating a robot that can do a backflip. It's not that straightforward with consciousness as we see, especially with phenomenal consciousness. So, and I think, here's a tentative argument, it will be a full slide when it's finished, to persuade you that there will be no empirical evidence forthcoming for universal computational correlates. If you buy that, so Vanya won't buy the first premise because he believes in IIT being computational. So AI consciousness presupposes computational functionalism about consciousness. Computational functionalism requires universal computational correlates, as Dave has said. That is, there would be medium-independent computational correlates of consciousness that are applicable to non-biological systems. Obtaining empirical evidence for universal computational correlates requires that we can isolate them from their biological realization in living organisms, and that additional indicators validate that the candidate computational correlate indeed yields conscious experience. So the A has been questioned by work by Rosa Tsao and Shirimuta and so on. You can't disentangle the functional from the structural properties so easily in the brain. Universal computational correlates cannot be empirically validated, I would claim, in biological systems, because contingently, there they are entangled with life-sustaining biological mechanisms which violates A. And that is what Anil Seth will be arguing in his maybe talk, but also especially in his BBS paper. So it's intricately connected to the biological machinery. It might not be, but in the systems we have tested, it is. So that's the problem. And it's not clear that the biological mechanisms don't play any role. So you can't validate them when they are still entangled with the biological mechanisms. But universal CCCs also cannot be empirically validated in non-biological artificial systems, like in a ChatGPT or so, because a zombie AI cannot be ruled out, given the way that phenomenal consciousness has been set up. That was the purpose of the first part of the talk. You know, it has been separated from everything that you can expect. There can always be a zombie. You don't have neural signatures because you only have a CCC, not an NCC, of course, because it's not a biological system. You don't have first-person indicators because you're not an AI. The behavioral indicators that could lead you there, they are very ambiguous. That's why people are fooled right now by ChatGPT and they claim they are conscious because they talk so well, right? As if language was important. And you can't just assume the computational candidates like a global workspace because that's what you want to find out. So, but it has a global workspace, you know? No, it doesn't have it might have a global workspace, but Ned Block may be right that only the biological human realization makes it conscious, and the other thing is just some kind of broadcasting. So you only have biological systems or non-biological systems, so there's no other. I think that's mutually exclusive. Is there a third category? I don't know. So I think then you can't test them. Therefore, universal computational correlates cannot be empirically verified, and that's bad news for like computational functionalism being assumed to be more plausible than a biological theory. There's two more coming if you take pictures. So. It's going to be full, I said, right? I promise. So therefore, computational functionalism cannot be established as being more likely than biological theories of consciousness, and therefore it shouldn't be assumed. I mean, Butlin and the whole group, they write a nice paper of if it were true. So if you assume it, what follows, what can we do, what's happening? I think that's a very thorough 80-page paper. But I think the evidence is leaning towards the biological naturalist side so far, and the burden of proof is on the computational functionalists to show it's all possible. Okay, so you could be chasing a ghost in a machine, because I said, like, you know, phenomenal consciousness is really set up in a very color qualia. It's really set up in a way that it's difficult to be satisfying in terms of research. So it's shielded from the investigative methods of cognitive science, so that no unique underlying mechanisms can be identified empirically, independent of cognitive phenomena, that's against Block, and that will produce any confounds, right? So you can't ensure that you don't produce confounds. What's now? So last week, Dave took a whole night for his slides and produced a talk in Bamberg again, when he introduced quasi-consciousness. So that's, you also introduced quasi-beliefs, quasi-ascriptivism in terms of what we deal with when we talk to ChatGPT and so on. So this is now supposed to be a move that allows that zombies aren't phenomenally conscious, but they are quasi-conscious. So it's a new notion that is supposed then to be different from cognitive access, I guess, but also different from phenomenal consciousness. But of course, it's not the real deal. I think it's, you know, I attribute that to a nice lunch conversation I had with Chris. So of course, if phenomenal consciousness is cheese, you know, you can have quasi-cheese, but it's just not the real thing. So I take that to be a confirmation of my claim. You know, introducing quasi-consciousness does not amount to be assessing phenomenal consciousness in AI. It's just not the same thing. So thank you very much.